I'm doing movement. Oh, we don't do it. So next fall was fun. It's not a lot of math, but it's more like understanding like the common or not.
All right. So today we are going to be talking about this time period in the Ordovician and the Silurian. But we're going to be kind of branching out a little bit to either side because we're going to be talking about plants. So we're going to start to get out of the oceans today. Okay. So framing where we are again. So we're in the Paleozoic, started with the Cambrian, kind of into the Ordovician. Silurian is coming next. So when we're talking about the evolution of terrestrial ecosystems, so moving to land, we're nesting ourselves somewhere in this time period. So different types of data date these movements to slightly different places. So most recently, people are always looking for the oldest, whatever it is. So our oldest dates for land plants have actually shifted kind of into the Cambrian based on some molecular data. So they've compared modern organisms, modern plants, and tried to estimate their time of divergence. So those dates that they get are somewhere in the Cambrian, but we don't start to see fossils of these land plants until later on. So into the Ordovician, but also honestly, don't become common until further on into the Silurian and the Devonian. But the oldest parts that we start to see are spores. So rather than like plants themselves and leaves, we start to see their reproductive parts showing up. Yeah. So reminder where we are, because at the end of class, we're going to start exploring a paleobiology, paleogeography database sort of picture research kind of thing. So around this time period, this is kind of what the Earth looks like. So we have a large continent called Gondwana, kind of in the south. We have a big ocean up top in the north, so the Panthalassic Ocean. And then we have some kind of flooded other land masses. So Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia are here. We have these shallow seas kind of surrounding the edges of these continents. So as we start to think about the land, we can think about why we don't see life here to begin with. So living on land is kind of difficult. It would be difficult for us to live underwater because we're not adapted to it. But as we start to move to land, organisms are going to experience really different conditions, and they're going to have to figure out how to deal with them. So the first most difficult thing that we're going to have to figure out how to handle is dehydration. So in the oceans, we're surrounded by water. Great, all good. We don't really have to worry about dehydrating. Dehydration is a problem for organisms, right? Because inside your cell, it's basically full of water, right? So if you remove water from cells, they shrink, they shrivel up, they dry out, they die. So we need to find some way to kind of maintain this watery environment or to not die when you dry it out. So they're kind of your two options there. So we're going to have to figure out how to solve dehydration. Second is support. So when you swim, right, water kind of holds you up, right? So you felt that difference because of the different density of water versus air. So in order to actually grow to any substantial size, move around on land, not that you need legs so much as you need something physically to help you resist gravity. This is true for plants, also technically true for you, but we first really think about it in terms of the plant. All right, so we need some way to support our structures if we're going to get big. Finally, we have a problem of reproduction. So in the ocean, if you want sexual reproduction to occur, so like sperm cells, egg cells, right, you can just kind of release them into the water, and then they float around in the water and eventually meet each other. And so you can think about like some fish kind of do that, right? Lots of sort of underwater organisms will just like leave piles of eggs somewhere kind of in a cave and just hope for the best, right? When we're on land, that's not going to work so well, partially because of that dehydration component, right? So if you leave watery cells just sitting around, one, they're going to dehydrate, but two, we don't have the same sort of movement through the ecosystem. So water has currents pushing cells and whatever's in that water kind of around, mixing it all up. But on land, unless it's something really light or wings that can float on air, pollen, you don't really have that same sort of distribution in cells. Okay. So in order to move to land, you have to kind of solve these problems. You have to have mutations that allow us to adapt to these new conditions, these different conditions. So first thing that we're thinking about moving to land are the plants. So here's a little overview of how we break up plants in terms of how they're all related to each other, right? So when we talk about plants, we're really talking about land plants specifically. When you use that word, pretty much never thinking about like green algae, although we do think that's the closest relative to our land plants that we see today. So the land plants are technically known, I'll just tell you this for maybe it's on the side. So there is a word for this group on its own. So like a science word, an actual clade, Embryophyta. So embryo, which tells you one of their synapomorphies actually. So land plants have embryos. Bryophyta. So as we can see, that origin of plants, these land plants, is somewhere in the Paleozoic around the time that we're talking about. So somewhere between 500 and 400 million years ago. So we're going to have our origin of plants. The first plants to branch off that we see, so sometimes the types of plants we use as a model for figuring out what the last common ancestor would have looked like during this time period. So the first plant on land. So our first branch here are our bryophytes. So these are things like mosses. Then we see the evolution of vascularity. So in the Paleozoic, so this is where we're going to see the evolution of like xylem and phloem. So these are structures that allow sugars to move around the plant, allow water to move along the plant, and are kind of why you can have trees, right? You can move water and the food that you're making further along. Also in the Paleozoic, we see the development of seeds. Okay. So these are really big changes to plants that we're seeing all in this era in the Paleozoic. And then the next major plant adaptation, plant mutation, plant evolution that we're going to talk about is going to happen much later on, is when we start to see flowering plants occur. So that's going to happen. So plants are one of 4 traditionally recognized kingdoms. So plants are different than animals, are different than fungi, are different than protists. So, oh, sorry, I should have said 4 traditionally recognized eukaryotic kingdoms. There's a word. So, other than our bacteria and our archaea. So the origin of land plants is happening somewhere around the Ordovician. So when we're thinking about how they moved to land, we're going to think about the structure of those marine ecosystems and how that's interacting with our continent. So far we've been in seas and oceans surrounding the continents, and a lot of the fossils we've been talking about have been occurring in these kind of shallow seas that have been flooded during the Ordovician and into the Silurian. So when we were speaking last time, we were somewhere in here, on the edge. Sorry, I just saw a fish swim by under the projector. Okay, so we have algae, We have plankton, we have things. Yeah, there are. I thought it was with a stuck in my eye.
Yeah, I think remember this slide. Maybe
I also thought it was on the slide, which was really startling. All right, so we have our algae occurring in these marine ecosystems, which are providing food to the invertebrates that we've been talking about, to some of the fish. The fish are feeding on invertebrates. We're about to see an explosion in our fish diversity as we move forward in time. But when we think about these sort of tidal ecosystems, so we're thinking about water moving back and forth, waves moving back and forth on the edge of our continent. So you all know when you think about waves, right? They go up on the shore, they rush back. Sometimes we leave stuff, right? So we see rocks, we see shells, we see whatever on the beach. This is also happening to the plants that are in that water. You can't always see them, especially not when we're thinking about little algae. But as we're having the water kind of lap at the edge of the land, they are getting deposited onto the shore. Sometimes we'll see them also deposited kind of into like pools, right? So you can imagine a wave coming up here and creating like a tide pool, or even a longer term kind of structure, depending how far up it is, depending on kind of weather pattern. So we expect that the algae probably first kind of started to cling onto rock surfaces that were getting periodically exposed. So sometimes out under the sun baking, but then sometimes covered by the tides, covered by water. So we still see algae on rocks today. We start to see some getting incorporated though into this biological soil crust. So we can see some microscopic algae down in there. So what we think is happening in this time period as we start to see land plants is that maybe we had some kind of hydroterrestrial algae. So kind of like algae on rock surfaces, probably they would have been able to live in both these moist environments and kind of survive on land for longer periods of time. Not until after that we would expect to see our first obligate land plant. So the first plant that really has to be on land, or the first plant that is on land long-term, reproducing on land, living on land for really its first total lifespan. Okay. And then we're going to start to see that branching out into the different groups of plants that we know today over time. So we got stressors that we're thinking about here. Lots of the stressors have to do with water, right? So we got drought happening here. We got dehydration in general. We also are going to have temperature differences that we're going to have to account for. Water can keep temperature a bit more stable. When you're on land, you're going to have more temperature variation, day versus night, things like that. You may have issues with salinity, so you may have like salt depositing on these surfaces as well. We're not going to have that nice mixing of solutes, sort of mixing of the environment in the same way if we're living on a little patch of ground. So, given these problems, why do you think you might bother moving to land? What advantage would this confer? What? Definitely less competition for food. And what's our food for a plant? And light, right? So when we're thinking about plants, right, we're going to be able to get more light there when we are no longer underwater. And to your food point, what's happening to the plants underwater? Yeah, they're getting eaten, right? So early on, as they're moving to the land, they're not going to be predated upon because we don't have those. Yeah, we don't have those herbivores as we start to move on to the land. We are going to see that they're then following, and that's when they're going to get new food, right? Those nice juicy plants that nothing else is eating. Okay. So we got light on the land. We also have a bunch of carbon dioxide accessible to them because of the in the air. They use that as their turning light into their sugars through photosynthesis. And they're escaping some of those underwater herbivores that can. So when we're thinking about these plants needing water, right, water is also necessary for photosynthesis. So related to this dehydration problem, right? We really think about dehydration when we think about plant evolution and plants moving to the land. And honestly, also, if we're thinking about like the plants in my office, right, they also don't love dehydration for multiple reasons, right? One of these is photosynthesis. So on the land, we have plenty of light availability. We got our light coming in, right? And we've got carbon dioxide coming in from the air, but we also do actually need water in order to do photosynthesis. So water is a necessary ingredient for these light reactions with the chlorophyll that is going to give us oxygen and ultimately also give us our sugar, which we can then use in order to produce ATP when there's not light, right? So produce energy for the cells of the plant to do their thing, work. We need water for photosynthesis. Found us a little dip of moss sperm here, right? So this is a depiction of plants today that actually, some of them do require moist environments for reproduction. So moss kind of need like rainwater to land on that moss in order to reproduce. So we have sperm, these flagellated cells really swimming to egg cells, even in some modern plants. And that's how we expect that our life cycle would have been working underwater as well. So our first plants would not have been vascular, so they wouldn't have had xylem and phloem, although we are going to see these adaptations within the Paleozoic just a little bit later on. So xylem and phloem are tubes transporting water to the cells that are doing photosynthesis. So think like going through a tree trunk out to the leaves, right? And then are then carrying food around, so carrying the products of that photosynthesis, so like sugars and stuff, out to other parts of the plant, right? So from the leaves back to the trunk, so that trunk can grow. So examples of non-vascular plants that we see today are green algae, but then also some of the scrubby little plants on the ground. So we have liverwort and hornworts that I think look kind of leathery. That's how I think of them when I think of these. And are probably more familiar mosses are non-vascular. So looking at these examples of non-vascular climates, what would you say is like a standout characteristic of these groups? What is the same between them? Yeah, they don't have our traditional leaf structures. No. They are green. Yeah, they're green because they're doing photosynthesis, right? So these are, yeah, so that's one of our characteristics of these plants. They're also all pretty low to the ground, right? So that low to the ground piece is related to this non-vascularity. So when we're thinking about plant tissues, right, or really, yeah, feeding plant tissues, I guess I'll say, right? All of these plants are going to have to move water around pretty much by like diffusion, osmosis, stuff going on, capillary action. They don't have structures that can like pump water, so they can't get very big, basically. So this is part of why they have to stay so small here. Another thing that we want to think about as we're thinking about these early plants is just briefly think about sort of geology of the substrate, so like the ground that they're living on. So when I look at the ground, I don't think all that much usually about the difference between rock and dirt and all the stuff that's underneath us, but for a plant, it's really important. So soil is actually its own kind of ecological community. It's its own thing. The soil actually has to form. We see soil actually kind of like evolve over time. So there are people who study like ancient soils and how they have changed throughout the history of life, throughout the history of the earth. So like a soil fossil is referred to as a paleosol. So they actually do analyze these like buried layers of soil deep under the earth, separately from like looking at our rock layers, our sediment layers. So the way a soil forms is we start with some kind of bedrock, right? So we've got some rock here, and we're going to start to weather. So as we have rain coming down onto that rock, it's going to start to break apart, right? Giving us our first sort of dissolved materials, kind of separating out some of those minerals. And then in the modern day, we start to see organic matter building up and continuing that breakdown process. So things like mosses, things like lichen are important for continuing to like break up that rock. This material then starts to kind of penetrate downwards. So we start to see that bedrock, you have to go deeper and deeper as we have this kind of buildup of organic material and mineral particles. We're also going to start to see animals of different kinds kind of churning this soil, this organic matter all together. Right? And so we see a well-developed soil is going to have different layers. So that organic material on top, minerals, and then we're going to start to see kind of different separation as we go deeper and deeper in the soil. So when we're thinking about early plants, really starting with rock that has started to disintegrate through weathering, but they don't have a fully developed soil to anchor themselves into, because formation of that soil really is a biological process, right? So to make the modern soils that we see today, that's the responsibility of a whole community of organisms, including plants and fungi that help that matter decay, or invertebrates underground like worms churning stuff together. So these early plants wouldn't have had all that sort of nice soil to anchor themselves into. Which is fine, because our ancient plants didn't have the same sort of root structures that we see in a lot of the plants we think about today. So some of our small plants living have these structures as well, but our ancient plants would have had likely these rhizoid structures, which are more like a thin stem, just kind of covered with hair, with hairs, instead of like long branching roots. So lots of mosses and stuff do still have structures similar to this. We see some structures kind of similar in some ferns, but the early plants wouldn't really have had all that much to anchor themselves into in the first place. So they're really kind of starting to cling onto that rock. Maybe these rhizoids are starting to break up that rock a bit as they are growing, but we don't have a nice deep soil to anchor ourselves into and to pull lots of nutrients out of. This picture of moss doesn't necessarily go with this bullet point, but I wanted you to take a look at it. So I put it here because there's space. So it is the case when we're thinking about dehydration of plants, that it's more of a problem for some plants than others. So this is a picture of a moss, or a video of a moss, I guess. And some mosses, they really can like completely defecate, completely die off and go kind of dormant until they are rehydrated. So this is kind of looking at that in real time. So when we think about ancient plants, and these ancient plants as potentially being avascular, non-vascular, not having really the ability to suck up water, move it around on their little plant bodies. We might think of a situation, something like this, being able to maintain their hydration state is not always necessary for every plant. Some plants, yeah, are able to have sort of cycles and tolerate that wet and dry, and just kind of thrive only in these situations when they are nice. So, looking at some adaptations to life on land, we see some features of plants that help largely with this dehydration. So one of the things we're going to look at are these structures called stomata. So that's the plural of the word stoma, so on this picture. Okay, so what do we see happening through these stomata on this example property? Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. So why would this maybe help a plant on that? Mm-hmm. So we need those gases for photosynthesis while we're absorbing light. How might this relate to like dehydration? Conditions on. It will release H2O. Actually, I think it probably should be more pictured, I think, when it's open, rather than drawing it on there. But yeah, so the stoma open and close, right? So basically, we're able to kind of control a little bit the permeability of our top layer of the plant. So we can start to kind of build a barrier between the air and the inside and more delicate structures of the plant that we can control and just kind of open when we actually have light available, right? So when we have open pores, essentially, this is going to allow water to evaporate from the structures of the plant. Now, there's not much we can do about that because we do have to essentially breathe in CO2 if we're a plant. We got to get our gases somewhere. But we really only have light available to us for up here as we get into winter, only like a couple hours a day, right? But anywhere you are, right? We got day and we got night. Why bother having evaporation happening out of your leaves in your structure at night when there's no light available and you can't even photosynthesize anyway? So one of the things that helps us kind of mitigate that dehydration of our plant is controlling that barrier and being able to like cover it over, except when we need to transport those gases back and forth. So those are our stomata. Also related to that sort of barrier is the plant cuticle. Right, so here we're kind of zooming in on a structure of some plant tissues here. So we can see that we actually have different layers of cells. And have you ever like touched a leaf and it's like kind of waxy? That's the cuticle. So that's a layer kind of sitting on top of the cells that also kind of blocks some of this evaporation, right? So some plants, lots of plants, you're gonna see water like really bead on the surface. So that's part of how they are controlling water from moving out of their cellular structures unnecessarily. Then we also see the development of vascularity, and this does happen relatively quickly when we're thinking about the life of plants on land. We kind of talked about it, but right, this lets you really control your internal water state because now you can move the water around. You can maybe even like store it places. You can get taller because you can get water out to the tips of branches. You don't have to rely on just hopefully there's enough water that the whole plant got soaked. So this really allows us to do a lot more things, right? So we're going to be able to diversify a lot more if we can kind of control that water state more and more. And then later on, we're going to see the development of seeds. So our earliest plants reproduce through spores. So spores are reproductive structures. We kind of think about them as like distributing the equivalent of like sperm, essentially. But they're relatively unprotected. So they do dry out. And actually in some of our plants, this is like the drying out is like partially key to their life cycle. So some of our ferns, for example, like the casings housing their spores burst open when they dry out. But spores are still going to be subject to the elements, right? They're going to get real hot, they're going to bump into things, they're going to get scratched, they're going to dry out. So as we adapt to life on land, we're also going to see the development of seeds. So we're going to start to have more like protective coatings around our reproductive structures. Land plants called embryophytes because they have plant embryos. So we're also going to start to see these protective structures growing around the plant embryo, which is actually forming kind of an microseed. So this is more a protection against the elements, as well as a unique sort of distribution mechanism. When we think about spores, they have to travel either through the air or through the water. So we're basically thinking about wind currents or water currents. When we move on to seeds, we're going to see that they can be carried around by things like animals. Early plants don't have animals in their environment, definitely not ones that can eat seeds and move them around yet. But as we see the development of these terrestrial ecosystems, and we start to have animals and moving things on the land, we're going to see this kind of co-evolution to move forward. So here we can see some of the sort of map of these terrestrial plants through time. So we're down here, we start to see spores somewhere in the Cambrian. Our molecular dates are kind of dating us back there. Maybe a little bit of evidence in the Ordovician, but then we start to actually see some actual plant fossils and more diversification kind of happening as we move into the Silurian. And then the Devonian will see a lot more groups present. And as we move forward, eventually we're going to see explosions of plants kind of at different times. So our earliest group that we can see here on this map are the Rhyniophytes. So this is a particularly ancient group of plants. Oh, it's kind of weird. Okay. So here's a depiction of something like an early Rhyniophyte. So these would have been some of the early kind of vascular plants. So we would have started with some kind of algae that is able to tolerate longer term dehydration, and probably some kind of like scrubby, non-vascular plant. Then relatively rapidly, more rapidly than they used to think, we see vascular plants forming so that we can maintain those internal water states and grow bigger. So we can see that this early plant has some dichotomous branching. So dichotomous just means like splitting in two. So we can start to see branching. We would expect these stems to be filled with structures like xylem and phloem as we're going out towards the tips of these plants. So this is a picture of one of the early fossils that we see when we're looking at fossil plants. So this is something called Cooksonia. So the plant versus our actual fossil. So you can see that branching pattern here. You can see this kind of like swelling at the tips. I suspect these are probably like the spore structures at those tips here. And we can see, yeah, we're not really seeing the leaves here on these early plants, at least not these depicted ones. So we're going to see ferns developing as we move later on, but here we can see that photosynthesis, at least on this one, it's really kind of limited in here in these stem structures, these kind of stalks. So here's another kind of depiction of some of these early plants, some of the diversification relative to the time period. So these rhiniophytes are really the ones that we see as we're going through the Silurian. You can see them kind of diversifying. So we go from just a few species to up to like 15 species here by the time we get to the end of the Silurian. And then they really die off and go extinct kind of before the end of the Paleozoic. And they get taken over by some other plants called Zosteraphils, and then we start to see something called Chimerophytes. And we can touch more on some of what's going on land as we move through our later videos. Now, as soon as we have plants on land, that means we've got like food on land. So we are relatively rapidly going to see our other taxa, so our other groups, moving to land, kind of following them. Okay? So we're going to see around the same time period that we start to see some invertebrates going to land. So invertebrates, anything that doesn't have bones, right? So it doesn't have vertebrae. So much of what we've been talking about to this point are our invertebrates, right? So like our mollusks, our a lot of these phyla that we've been talking about are arthropods. That's the word I was looking for. We think a lot about arthropods when we think about invertebrates because so we're going to have some invertebrates moving from these marine ecosystems, following plants to the land, which means we're now going to start to see kind of churning of that soil. So we're starting to develop more well-developed soils. And we're starting to build a fuller ecosystem on land, right? So we got them eating plants. Once we got a couple of them, they can start eating each other. So we're starting to develop more types of life, more ways of life available to us on the land as we start to have more and more groups moving. Relatively recently, they've realized that fungi were also moving to land earlier than they thought. So fungi, their own group, their own kingdom, fungi are not plants, but a lot of fungi are closely associated with plants and kind of symbiotic with plants. So they found 460 million year old mycorrhizae in some Ordovician deposits actually just over in Wisconsin. So mycorrhizae you want to think about as like, honestly, it's kind of the body of a fungus. It's going to potentially look a bit more like roots if you were to dig some up, kind of like white and fuzzy looking when you're looking at that. But that's actually the body of a fungus when you're looking underground. Like a mushroom coming up is actually just the reproductive structure. It's not the whole organism itself. That's really just the spore distribution. So we see these mycorrhizae underground. We can see them now in the fossil record. And lots of mycorrhizae grow in combination with plants. And they're kind of like trade nutrients back and forth potentially. Mycorrhizae and fungi are helping matter decay, right? So that's kind of great for a plant if you're right next to some fungi that are decaying organic matter. Suddenly you're having like those nutrients that are just being exposed and recycled near the root of the plant. So it's kind of helpful. And these symbiotic relationships between plants and fungi are an area of like ongoing research. Pretty cool. So we got all this stuff kind of starting to develop relatively early on in the Paleozoic. So we're going to take some time to explore now. It's something called the Paleobiology database. Or just, as you're doing this activity, I put up a Google form. So in order to actually have a goal while you're looking at this website, I want you to think of just like a simple question to consider. You're going to think about like a time period you might be interested in, some geography, either modern continents or these ancient continents, groups of organisms, and probably based on what I'm about to show you about how this website works, your question should probably have to do with some way like the distribution of your group of organisms, so like where you find them, or like how many of them there are, so like their diversity, their kind of spread number of species. So let's take a look at this. Oh, watch their little walk there.
Navigator is a visual form that allows anyone. So from paleobiology.org, go to explore. So Navigator consists of three. Here is a map showing continents, and each one of these dots here represents the color of the dot represents the age corresponding to here. Click on a dot, you can see information on the site. So here's a summary of two different possible currents of how these on this one, and the point about it, and the occurrences of how exactly what down here we have a geologic time scale that shows you you click on the time scale, shows you you look over here and unclick that, we'll go back to in order to do an out time scale, you go back and you should or time period here that if I want to go back to and back. Cenozoic. Over here is the toolbar, and the toolbar shows all the tools you can use. Plus and minus to be included, they include out from the top. The confidence icon will provide any of the instructions, but only if you're at a fine enough control resolution. So, for example, if I was to go to the Paleozoic and click on the icon, it's going to give me sort of like a random time. So if I click on the Carboniferous, Permian, you can see getting more fine stuff. And you can see that it's mapping on awesome. The bug icon allows you to do points. So here it asks you to enter facts on the name. So this is the lands. Data. And so we give you a number of different options here. You can go for the class.
And actually, not here. So if we come back over here, you'll see our filter justification and show us the analysis. Because failed to involve patients. So, thank you. We're gonna go to this. So, the error we're getting here is that we're still on the side of reconstruction. We're gonna come out. Now it's going to bring us to the center and the solution. Maybe one of these dots here, we're going to take a question. It means at least one. So we'll look at the center dot process. Also add in text up here. And again, it'll auto fill. And this is going to create differences. Box pops up. Now, there seems to be an issue right now. Really small, so my apologies here. What we're looking at is the entire header. It's telling us up here that it's disabled in the same version. Our current view is our map view of the entire globe and our transparent. Right here, we'll see a little question box. So we'll plot. We'll click on it. It's going to tell us exactly what we need. Table in the university, which considers occurrences of they give you a little more detail. Now we can change the.
And that is probably good for our level of what we want to do. All right. I meant to do. All right. So go ahead and kind of click around in here, get familiar. Ask yourself a simple question. Doesn't need to be anything fancy, but let's stick for something in some part of the Paleozoic, but the time period we're interested in right now. So you can pick some fish stuff, some invertebrate stuff, some plant stuff, and just kind of play around. Kind of ask me in the form. It just asks like, what was your little question? What did you look at? And then just take like a screenshot of whatever you look at. So either like a screenshot of the map that you found, or if you want to make one of those little plots that you're just talking about, you can take a screenshot of that and upload that, depending on what you're kind of looking for. Sound good?
Does it have to be defined yourself? Or is it?
Stick to the Paleozoic right now. We'll probably play around with this a bit in the future.
Could you give us like an example of a question? Just
Sure. Like I might ask like, what modern continents do you find Silurian plant fossils on?
okay.
Or like, where were the trilobites in blah blah blah?
Okay.
What are you looking at? Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah.
I was